common and howdy. And in the UK there are two things that are very rare at the moment. One is sunlight, and we've actually got some, so hurrah. And the other one is a working AMX-13 75. You will have noticed our little videos we make on the FARG Motorpool are very much focused on French armour, and today is no exception. So we're going to be going around this in great depth, looking at the different aspects of the vehicle, living with it, working with it, and the foibles that you have to watch out for. If that's not really your thing, having that sort of in-depth analysis, then by all means we've got lots of other fun content on the FARG Motorpool. Please hunt around, subscribe, and have a look about. Okay, so with no further ado, we're going to jump into this video. So, AMX-13 75. AMX-13 is the manufacturer, so that's Atelier Moulinon, and I'm sure I've massacred the pronunciation, and someone will pull me up on that. 13 is the weight designation or the weight class. I think they started out about 13 tons, but as the vehicle developed over the years, it actually crept up slightly. This one might be coming in at 14, maybe 15, because it's got extra bits added to it that weren't in the original design. The 75 bit at the very end of its nomenclature means 75 millimeters, so that's the size of the gun. So if you had an AMX-13, that's an AMX tank weighing 13 tons, 75 millimeter. If it's an AMX 1390, then it's 90 millimeter, and then the final incarnation was the 105. I'm probably going to put a little bit up in the video here showing me driving mine. There we go. So you can see that gun's got quite big towards the end of its service life. So with no further ado, I think we're going to start walking around the vehicle and we'll start looking at particular aspects of it. And to watch out, because there's some very dangerous elements on this tank, and you must be aware of them when you're in them, moving around them, or they're actually operating. The running gear on the AMX-13 series of tank was pretty much standardised. There were some changes throughout its life cycle, but mostly we're looking at 5 road wheels, which are in contact with the track and on with the ground. We have a drive sprocket at the front and a rear idler. What you do notice is there were some slight changes in the rear idler through its life. It started as sort of a pressed steel sheet with holes perforated in it, and then it turned into the one that we've got here, which is sort of reinforced bars or sort of splines within it. The front drive sprocket really didn't change that much. It was very different in the prototype against the production, but this went through the AMX-13 troop carrier, it was seen in the mortar carrier, it was seen in all the different versions of the tank destroyer, and also in the SPG. Incidentally, we have a couple of those here, and we'll be making a video about those very soon. So, with all these different iterations, what does the track setup tell us? Well, we've got these which are called return rollers, and we have those along the top, and they're actually carrying the top of this track. On the early versions, they didn't have any return rollers at all, and that track used to flap around like Billy-O. And after that, then 2 became evident, 3, and then in the final incarnation, which we've got here, we actually have 4 return rollers. On the front here, these drive sprockets, they actually have a set of driving teeth. There's 2 of them, and these are removable. You can see the bolts here. You take these off and that actually comes away. And there's one on the rear. So this is one of the things that would wear on the tank and needed constant inspection and therefore replacement. Here we are at the front. We have a really good view of the track. The tracks on these came in 2 incarnations. One was an early one in which the rubber pads were simply pressed into place on rubber spikes, and we'll show you that in a moment on one of the other vehicles. This is the later type of track, and you will see that the pad is actually bolted in place, so they were a tendency to stay longer attached to the track than the ones that were simply pressed on. Also on this vehicle you will notice as well that there are these holes either side of the pads, and these were to put in ice spikes. They were small drilled material that was sat into these particular holes, and as the tank moved forward it actually pushed them into place and they stayed there. So don't often see that. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen a picture of a tank with the ice spikes fitted, but that's what these small holes are for on the edge. How do these tracks work? Well, it's very simple. They're linked together and they just have a pin through with 2 collets on the end. And if you watch one of our earlier videos, we were checking on our AMX-13 105 that those were still in place, because the loss of one of those pins will mean the loss of the track, and well, you can work out the consequences from there. So how does the suspension work in one of these? Well, it's quite effective. What happens is behind this wheel there is an arm. The arm is attached through the body of the hull and goes in and attaches to a torsion bar. So for those people that don't know what a torsion bar is, it's basically a long bar of metal. It's fixed at one end and it has the suspension on the other, and as the suspension moves it basically twists the whole length of metal, and it's that resilience that actually creates the suspension. You do find this especially in World War II German tanks, and undoubtedly the French must have looked at those designs, especially of the Panther, etc., and thought that's a good idea, and hence when this vehicle was starting to be produced in as early as 1947, then you could see the torsion bar suspension appearing. On the front here we have a gas shock absorber, and you usually have this on the first wheel and on the last wheel. That's simply to absorb any bumps as the vehicle's driving along. The earlier versions would have had very much like a bicycle pump in effect, so it's a long tubular shock absorber. These are now moved over to oil-filled sort of cantilever versions. On the back of the vehicle, on the earlier AMXs, then that shock absorber was actually on the inside of the hull, but on the later versions it's brought to the outside. Quite dark back here, I hope you can see this. This is how we tension the tracks. So as we use the tracks, they're going to stretch very slightly over time. And what we need to do is to keep a constant tension in that track. If it becomes too loose, then there's a chance it could shed or it could flap around and hit the bodywork. So this is the tensioner. This is how we ensure that that track is always tight, or relatively tight. The tension is quite simple. There's a locking nut that comes off, and here is a worm drive, and as you spin it around it basically pushes this rear idler out on this arm and tensions up the tracks. Once you finish that, you then do the nut back up and that holds it in place. How often do you need to tighten your tracks? Depends what you're driving on and how fast you're going, how often you use it. So at the moment we just do it once a year, but I would imagine these in service they will be looking at them on a daily basis to see if they need to bring that tension up. And you may ask, how do you know what the right tension is? It's very simple. You pull the track as tight as you can around the entire vehicle until you've got a very small depression, or the track is hanging over the two middle rollers. And if you can get your fist in, then that's great. If you've got more space than that, it needs a bit tightening up, and if you can't get it in, then you need to loosen it. This AMX13 is quite an early-ish one, so therefore this would have probably been exported out of France and used abroad. In fact, I think we know the history of this one, and it went to the Dominican Republic. The one reason I know that this didn't stay inside French service is because they used to delete this. This back here is the telephone. You simply open this hatch and, well, this one's been disconnected. The handset comes out and you can actually talk to the driver and or the commander in the turret. The reason for this might be to adjust fire, or to let them know that they were infantry. But as you can imagine, what a very dangerous thing to do. So this is the first one of the major foibles with the tank. You can imagine you're stood behind the tank making a phone call, it hasn't been connected and the driver decides to reverse. No wing mirrors on this thing, so it's just going to drive straight over you. So the French, knowing that, and they may have had those sort of problems during its period, then they usually used to delete this element here. So what you end up with is two running lights and a gap along this portion of the tank. These grated covers here is where the air was sucked in over the tanks, through the body of the tank and out the front. So we'll cover why that was happening, but just to let you know that this is where the air was taken in. It's when we reference it later. Under here we've got a fuel tank, and there's one over on this side. They've got two separate filler caps. They're basically brass caps which are down inside, and the tank is sat here. So it's 240 litres in this one, 240 in that, and they're actually linked together. You can not link them if you wish by turning the tap off, or you can actually link them to run them at the same time. Why two fuel tanks? Possibly because if you were running off of one tank, the other one got damaged, or bad fuel was noted to have gone in one of the tanks, at least you've got sort of 50% chance of keeping the thing running by switching your tanks out. You probably might wonder what this is. So this is a trough, we call it, and in here was where any of the personal items of the crew and indeed the camouflage net would have sat. Not much space inside the tank, you'll see that later. Not much space or stowage on the outside, so majority of the crew's equipment was actually carried in another vehicle, which would have to follow them around, I guess, around the battlefield. So yes, this is about the only portion of storage that we've got. You may be observant and say, well, there's bins down the side on top of the tracks. Well, they were totally occupied by all the accessories that needed to go with this. So inside of those bins would have been kept all the necessary items to keep that tank rolling when it was out in the field. So here we are on top of the engine deck of the AMX. I'll just talk through what you can actually see. So over here we have two grills, these longitudinal ones, and under there are vital parts of the engine that you need to get to. So over here you're looking at your water level, and over here you're looking at, well, to be honest, I think it's oil level in there, but I usually go inside to do that. In the middle is the fan. It's quite a distinctive noise, and most film you might see of AMX tanks driving around, you can sort of hear the engine in the background, but the fan is quite a loud bit of kit. So why is there a fan? Well, this is a water-cooled engine. So the engine sat in the front. It's a flat 8 engine. I think it's about 12 litres. I need to have done my research a little bit closer on that, but it's around 12 litres. And at the back here is where the radiator is. It sits between the back of the engine and the basket of the tank. That's not a great place to have it to cool an engine, because usually in motor cars you have those radiators right at the front where it's catching most of the air. So the French linked a fan directly to the top of the petrol engine, and this sucks air through the entire vehicle and blows it out through the fan, which is really good. I mean, it's bringing cooling air through. Any noxious gases are expelled from inside. The air's drawn in mostly over the fuel tanks at the back under those two grills that I was talking about earlier, but when you're in the driving position and this hatch is open, the air's pulled over you, and it's the same for the commander and the gunner when they're sat in the turret. That was the downfall of the tank. The reason being, when the battlefield became NBC, so nuclear, biological and chemical agents were expected to be on the battlefield, having a tank that was sucking those detritus out of the air and covering the driver and the crew, and then covering the engine and blowing out the front, right in front of where the commander was sat, was not a good thing to do. So therefore it was not NBC proof. It was intended that the crew would actually wear their NBC equipment, and the French NBC equipment in those days was extremely rudimentary. Quite a big mask, a cape, big sort of rubber over boots, and actually driving or operating inside of one of those in that environment must have been absolutely hideous. Was there any plus to having a big fan blowing out hot air right at the front of the tank? Absolutely. And that benefit was you could dry your socks on it. So therefore, if you got wet at any point, there would be a fight over who could access the fan. Indeed, there are some photographs of some conscripts standing over the fan and having that hot air blown up their trouser legs. So therefore, drying out all the important areas for allowing you to operate the tank. We have an engine hatch here, so this is how we actually get the engine out. It's very complicated. There's a partial disassembly that has to happen inside, and it's brought forward on a set of rails, angled at 45 and then 90 and pulled out upwards. It does help that the turret's taken off when you're actually doing that as well, so it's quite a major operation to change the engine in this. Therefore, I would suggest that although there are evidence that the Israelis, when they were using this tank, did change these engines in the field, I would suggest that it was quite a major undertaking, and certainly nothing you could do anywhere near the front line. Also down the front we have a spare wheel and we have a spare set of tracks. You may wonder, why are those kept on the glassy plate at the front? Well, as we've talked about before, the thickness of the armour isn't great, so therefore having these extra bits attached to the front, rather like the US forces practice in World War II, that was going to give extra defence to the front and to the driver. Indeed, that was one of the thoughts behind having the engine in the front of the tank, is that it would afford some sort of protection to the crew behind, because obviously either the gearbox and transfer or the engine would soak up any of the incoming rounds and therefore protect the crew. When you see the side view of this tank, in fact sort of the silhouette, you do notice that the turret has something called an autoloader. That is a misdemeanor. It's actually not an autoloader, it's a semi-automatic loader if you were going to be that pedantic. But we can talk about that in another video. That hangs out in what's called a bustle, so it's a big square box on the back of the turret. The turret was originally designed before the Second World War and went on to very early Panhard EBR design chassis. When the Germans invaded France, then they needed to hide that vehicle because they felt it was cutting edge, and so it was transported, it is alleged, to Morocco or Algeria, and perhaps it's still there under a sand dune somewhere. What a fantastic find if you could get hold of it. So the turret design being oscillating, so the top half is moving separately than the bottom half, and the bottom half is what rotates. I've described this once before, sort of an ashtray with a ball in it, and basically the turret moves up and down like this. So to have that that semi-automatic loader in this bustle at the back means the back of the turret overhangs. Why is that a problem? The size of the chassis isn't very big, so when the turret rotates, that large bustle comes moving across the driving position. If the gun is elevated, which you do see lots of pictures of AMXs on the internet with the gun elevated, that means that bustle is come down quite low and would, if it hit the driver, decapitate him. So this is foible number 2. This tank will decapitate the driver if the turret is rotated and the chap is not in the down position. How can we stop that happening? One would be to restrict the movement of the gun, which they wouldn't or didn't want to do. Number 2 is to put an alarm, but again, if you're on the thick of war, I'm sure you probably wouldn't hear a little alarm bleeping. Or secondarily, they very cleverly built into the hydraulic system of the turret a feedback arc. So if it hit anything, it would feed back to the turret and stop it. That had to be quite a fair wallop. It wasn't if it would just hit a tree or a bit of foliage, but actually something major. So this is where the safety of the driver came in. If we open up the hatch, you see it comes up and it swings to the side. That design's good, because what it's basically doing is sliding out the way. If the hatch just went vertical, then the gun or the bustle would collide with it. But it's actually linked to this, which is called the driver protection. This is very simple piece of metal, and when the turret rotates, if it hits the edge of this, it will actually put the feedback through the system and stop the turret rotating any further. So that means by hitting this protector that the turret, that the position is open and the driver's most probably got his head sticking out. Does it work? Yes, it does, because we were at a show and we didn't have anybody else apart from myself in the turret, and we were doing a display, and the turret went a little bit further than expected, hit that particular protector, and it cut out the hydraulics, which is great, shows that it perfectly works. So that's what this weird shaped piece of metal is that you only see when the hatch is open. At the front of the hull, you'll see what we describe as the crutch, and the crutch is 2 separate arms that come together to hold the barrel. The reason for that is, if this was driving at some pace across open countryside, there is a tendency for that barrel to bounce. Bouncing wasn't good for the hydraulics inside the turret, especially if they weren't switched on. If they were on, they could compensate, but if they weren't on, then it could move around. That's why you do see many photographs of these in service or in exercises, and the guns always seem to be pointing up in the air, and you wonder why. It's simply because over time of movement, they just naturally point upwards. Going around the outside of it, we've got obviously radios. There were 2. There was a major one down inside by the feet of the commander. He also had another small one in front of him, so one was sort of radio interface into other radios, and the one on the top was linked to some of the infantry, so he was able to speak to them quite readily. So this was a great improvement over the tank designs that the French had during the Second World War, in fact where some of the tanks didn't have a radio at all. So now we've actually got 2. We've got the major unit, it's for long distances down inside, and a smaller unit for speaking to infantry up in front of the commander. On the outside, so that's the radio aerial. On the outside as well, we have these. These are the smoke dischargers, so a canister would be dropped inside of here. They would be armed, and then on the inside, well, armed, that's actually just taking the base off, so you could take the canister out or clear it if there was an issue. These are linked electronically inside. There's a switch and a safety that you have to pull on a chain, so it exposes the fire button. You press the fire button and these would fire out. So there's 2 on this side and 2 on the other tank designs. A nice little touch we have here, and this is, if it'll open, is the fire extinguishing system. So if you had to, this being a petrol, if you had to dive out and things were looking pretty grim, we reach in here, pull on this, and the carbon dioxide would flood the inside of the vehicle and try to put that flame out. The other thing to have note on the outside of this vehicle is this little door at the back. I was asked a number of times what this door is used for, and we used to joke and say very small crew members. The actual reason is this is where the spent round is ejected from. So inside, I'll take you inside slightly. I don't know how much you're going to be able to see in the dark. Okay, in here we've actually got what I would describe as a trough. The rounds are over to the left and right, and they fall into this trough and are taken forward on a piston and thrown into the breech. When the gun's fired, it recoils, this comes back, the fork comes down to let the round out, the round bounces outwards and onto the floor. The fork snaps back up and the door naturally shuts afterwards. Here at the front, this is a very straightforward part of the vehicle, but I'll take you through it anyway. We have tie-down D-shackles here for when this went onto lorries, or mostly onto trains. You have this element here, which may not become apparent immediately, but this is what could be described as a bow. And the reason is, rather like a boat, when it was entering the water, there was a tendency, so let's have a look here, because the front is actually sloped, that the water could rush up over and swamp the driver. So this here was really to push that water forward again when it was going what it was actually fording, and this would actually on the top of the turret. We're actually over the bustle at the back. Just out of shot here, we've got the air extraction unit, so that was when the gun was firing it, so it would pump all those noxious gases out of the turret. And over here is another little door, and this was to access the carousels. Inside the vehicle, and I'll show you another picture that's going to appear over here, there were two carousels. They held 6 rounds and they would rotate. So there was 12 rounds held in the turret in this portion of it. And those would then be chosen by the commander. They would roll down into that trough that we spoke about before. They would be thrown forward into the breech, and then the vehicle was fired. To actually get around out of the carousel and into the trough was a manual process. So a handle had to be wound, the round selected, and it would then fall in. So this isn't what it would be described as an auto-loader. An auto-loader would be a machine picking a round, placing it into the chamber and the gun firing it and then being rejected. The fact is there is human use or human choice actually choosing the rounds, which is great, but they actually have to crank a handle. So it's not really done automatically and doesn't fall into that definition of an auto-loader. I would call it a semi-auto-loader. Anyway, that's aside. To get the rounds inside of the carousels, you had to open up the doors on each side of the turret. The round then would be fed into it, 6 on this side and 6 on the other. There are urban myths that this particular vehicle, once you'd used up the 6 rounds here and 6 over there, that was it. You had to sort of run away and go and get some more and reload the turret from the outside, which is obviously very dangerous in a war zone. That's not the case at all. The turret also had a number of rounds that were stored vertically, and also around the inside of the hull was another set of rounds. They could be manually placed inside of the gun. So obviously it was fired, it would again eject the round, but you could manually load this. Obviously it would take longer. You weren't able to do it as quickly as if you were using the carousels, but you didn't have to run away and try and get on the outside of the vehicle to be able to use it. Admittedly, putting rounds back into the carousels from inside, again, is actually possible, but it's a really, really fiddly business. So we move forward now, and we are in the commander's coupler. And we have here a number of vision blocks which give excellent all-round visibility. Also, here we have the hatch. And you do notice that this one's domed when the other for the loader, which we'll look at in a moment, it's quite flat. So why is this domed and that one not? The reason is so you could get your head inside of it. That is because if each of these vision blocks were shattered, then what you could do is raise this up slightly on a hydraulic arm to give you a little slit to look out of. And obviously you wouldn't be able to look out of it if it was a flat roof. So therefore you had this dome to be able to get your head in. These though is if it's not locked in the right position, there can be a tendency if you're driving along that these will actually move across. As you can imagine, as we spoke about the driver, this would decapitate you if you had your head out. So there we go, another foible of the vehicle. It really does like decapitating people who use it. So therefore we must make sure that this is locked. Otherwise, if it's not locked, so I'm unlocking it there, it can move forward when the vehicle is and squish. You've had it. Okay, so this here is the breech of the gun, so it shows you how close it is actually to your head. This is the lever here that you choose the rounds from the carousel. We actually have the radio here for talking to infantry that we spoke about, and there's the internal comms. What you can see down the very bottom down here, those circular elements, I think there's 5 of them, that's where the shells could be held vertically there for you to load them into the gun should the carousels be empty, and you can just about make out the larger radio at the bottom. The driver's seat down here, and this is a fantastic, I don't know whether this one will come up or not, quite a weird little, very French design. This is a small seat, and this seat was designed for you to sit on it in parades. Yeah, so not for combat, just for parades, so you could sit out of the tank and look very smart. I can imagine they certainly were scratching their heads when that requirement was talked about in the design of the tank. Oh, we must have a tank in which we look great in parades in it. So, okay, very French, and what an interesting little thing. I don't know any other tanks that come with parade seats, but there you go. Lastly, we'll go over the other side and we'll have a look at, well, you won't describe them as a loader because it's a semi-automatic weapon, but let's go over there and have a look. So this is the gunner's position. So the hatch is slightly different, it's flat because there's no chance really for the chap needs to poke his head out at all. His job was totally inside the turret. Quite claustrophobic, I would think. The commander's obviously got a seat that allows him to look out. The driver's seat raises so he can look out, but this position, no. You were very much staying inside. He has a folding down seat that we'll have a look at in a second, and over at the front he has his controls. So these controls are we working on this one? Yeah, okay. So these controls are very simple. You are moving them forward and that depresses the gun. You're pulling them back and it lifts it. I think it goes down to about -4 in depression and a little bit higher coming up. That'll appear on the screen, those details in a moment, because I've temporarily forgotten them. We'll call it a senior moment. Also, this goes from the left to the right, and that rotates the turret left and right. When the motors are on in there, it's quite a noisy bit of kit actually, so it's good that all tank drivers really would have worn ear defence to keep those outside noises out. So we'll squeeze down in there and see if we can have a look down inside the gunner's position. So in front of you, you've got the sight itself. So this is a magnified sight, and it has the graticals inside of it and helps you aim the main armament. Here in front of you are those controls that we spoke about. So it's the joystick, shall we say, that controls the hydraulics. If you needed to use the turret without these hydraulics weren't working, we have a handle here that can be rotated, so that rotational handle that takes the gun up and down, and there's another one down under here, I don't know if you can see it, and that's for rotating the turret left and right. And my goodness, look at all of these hydraulic pipes. It was quite a masterpiece how they managed to get all of this in such a small turret. Just here, that's not fitted on this one, but we'll have a look at my AMX at a later date. That's where the machine gun, the coax machine gun went. This canvas bag above it was where it was fitted into the turret air extraction system, so any fumes from the gun were sucked harmlessly outwards. Expended rounds would drop down into a bag, that's not fitted here at the moment, and then the bag would be emptied when they were in a safe position. Here we have the radio, intercoms, and finally down here, this is one of the lights to light it up. Down on the floor, you can actually see 2 pedals. That's right down at the bottom, dark ones running from left to right. The right hand one is for firing the main gun, and the left hand one is for firing the machine gun. So you didn't have to manually pull any levers, you were able to use your feet down there and set those off. Lastly, looking up and around, and we can actually see one of the carousels here quite clearly. So you can see it's a rotational cylinder, and they were dropping down. The gun's currently in recall because we're doing some work on it. So the gun wasn't, the back of the breech wasn't always in that position. Not much room. The conscripts were probably about, or the users of this in the French army were probably about 17 years old, rather slim. So us larger gentlemen find it very interesting sliding in and out of this. So you've got two bodies in the turret here, one in the driver. There really isn't much room for any manoeuvre whatsoever. Interestingly, the driver can get through to the turret. There is a connecting, we'll call it corridor, that's behind his seat, that goes through into the turret basket. But interestingly, the turret basket, if it's facing forward, the driver can't get out his driving position. The gun has to be at least 20 degrees to the right or 20 degrees to the left. Again, another foible of this machine is the fact that if there was an issue and the driver had to get out, then someone had to rotate the turret either to the left or right to allow him out. Now, if you can imagine in a fire situation where the thing is alight, I think the first thing you'd be doing is getting out and not necessarily rotating turrets. Talking about escape, I'll just show you very quickly where the escape hatch is, because there is one underneath, so you can actually drop below. Good luck. It's not a very big gap because this tank sits quite low. I think it sits a bit lower now because it's an older tank. Back in the day, the torsion bars would have been a bit fresher and it would have sat slightly higher, but it is quite low to the ground, unlike the American designs, and so therefore sliding out underneath one of these is quite a feat. So we're looking down the driver's position, and this down here, so this is this angular piece of metal, that needs to be undone. There's two sets of locking twists there. That gets lifted up and thrown away. Then underneath that is the actual escape hatch. Big handle on it, you turn it hard to the left and it drops out onto the floor. So you can imagine, in the worst case scenario, you had a driver who was stuck in the driving position. We had to rotate the turret to try and allow him to get in. That's if these rounds weren't in place, because they'd have to be knocked out of the way. Now the floor's covered in all the rounds, so they've got to be moved. Then the floor's got to be taken up. Then you've got to reach down and undo the escape hatch and hope that you're not on soft ground, because otherwise you'd be so close to the ground you wouldn't be able to get out anyway. So quite a death trap, as all tanks really are, but this one especially so, because you really don't have any room to manoeuvre. So, in conclusion, a small vehicle, it's only about 2.5 metres in width, about 5 metres in length, very light, between 13 up to about 15 tonnes. Once you get into the SPG, about 17 tonnes. Petrol engine. To drive, they're very easy, actually. Once you get used to the gear stick. And there are two tillers as well, but we can go through that in another video. We're really just looking at the outside aspects of the tank in this video. If this is the sort of thing that you like this in-depth analysis of tanks, then please drop some comments below encouraging us to do so, and we can do that on more vehicles. We do have a AMX-13 VTT, which is the armour personnel carrier, which we can do a video on very soon. And we've got two versions of the AMX-13 self-propelled gun, and they're very interesting. As one of them's incredibly rare beasties, there's only 4 were ever made, so we can go through that. So yeah, drop those comments below. Please do subscribe to us, because that gives an indication you want us to continue. In conclusion then, a great little tank. It lasted a long time, saw service from about the mid-50s all the way through to the current day. They're used in Ecuador, Bolivia, Cyprus, Mexico have some in reserve. I don't think they've ever got those out, but it shows that this tank is actually still current. And if you think of how long that has lasted, that's quite an achievement on something that went on a drawing board at the end of the Second World War, and within 2 years was the prototype was being manufactured. So great to see this. I think there are only possibly 2 of these running in the UK. There's about 5 of them spread out across with private owners and in museums. So if you do see myself or any of the chaps from the FARG Motorpool and you can see this tank around, always come over and have a chat and we can go through and show you all elements of it. So thank you for joining me. Ta-ta for now, and we'll see you in our next video.